July 26, 1953, Fidel Castro and 160 guerrilla fighters attacked the Moncada military barracks in an attempt to instigate a popular uprising. Most of the guerrilla fighters were killed during the attack, and Fidel and his brother were arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison.
Later, in 1955, the Castros were released following a political amnesty, and they fled to Mexico. On June 12, 1995, the 26th of July movement was created.
Following the creation of his movement, Castro and his 82 men arrived to Cuba on December 2, 1956, after boarding the Gran Mayat in Mexico on November 26 of that same year. All of his men, except for 12, were killed or captured on arrival, and those who survived retreated to Sierra Maestra Mountains. Among those men were Fidel and his brother. The rebels collected many volunteers and gained supporters as they pushed across the island. They had many victories over Batista's armed forces. Although they were less than 200 guerrilla fighters, they continuously forced the Cuban army, which was composed of more than 35,000 soldiers, to retreat. The guerrilla fighters managed to capture Sierra Maestra entirely.
By March 1958, Cuban relations with the U.S. had changed drastically. This contributed to the defeat of Batista's forces, since the U.S. called back the military aid they had sent. On June 28, 1958, Batista made a final attempt to regain control over the mountains. This operation was named Operation Verano, which consisted of sending 12,000 troops to attack Castro and his men. The two battles that took place are known as Battle of La Plata and Battle of Las Mercedes. The operation, however, failed, and the Cuban army was left demoralized. The army lost 86 men, while the rebels only lost 3. Castro took this opportunity to launch his own offensive.
After experiencing imminent defeat, Batista fled to the Dominican Republic on January 1, 1959. The following day, a military commander ordered his troops not to fight against Castro's. After many triumphs, the 26th of July movement and the rebels led a victory march into the Cuban capital, Havana, where Fidel Castro finally arrived on January 8th, marking his victory over Batista's government.
After overthrowing Batista, Castro's new government in Cuba erratically drifted towards communism and the Soviet Union, which caused a dichotomy within the Cuban population. Thousands of Cubans emigrated to the United States, Spain, or any other countries. During his presidency, Castro abolished legal discrimination, created employment, brought electricity to the countryside, and invested in health and education, such that even today, Cuba's health and education systems are remarkable amongst Latin American countries. His governing policy contrasted with the American expectation of a free market and the freedom of speech. Castro's governance saw things that are extremely stigmatized today, like jailings of political opposition, the limiting of the amount of land that a person could own, and the nationalizing of all companies, even those owned by the United States. Following Castro's decision to nationalize U.S.-owned businesses without compensations, on October 19, 1960, the U.S. placed an embargo on exports to Cuba except for food and medicine. The U.S. also ended all diplomatic relations with Cuba to reduce the threat posed by its alignment with the communist powers. Cuba's economy became centrally controlled and the government decided everything, but there is a special focus towards the poor. Since Castro was a big danger at the time of the Cold War, on April 17, 1961, the U.S. carried out the Bay of Pigs operation to oust Castro. The first bombers missed their targets and the next airstrike was cancelled. This caused the operation to fail and the loss was overwhelming, and about 100 exiles were killed in the fighting and the rest were captured. They were only released in 1962 in exchange of medicine and baby food from the U.S., worth $52 million. Later that year, on June 1, 1961, Turkey and the United States agreed to deploy 50 nuclear missiles in Turkey. This deal was advantageous, seeing as Turkey shares a border with the Soviet Union.
After seizing power over Cuba, Castro aligned himself with the Soviet Union and grew dependent on their military and economic aid. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane passing over Cuba photographed Soviet missiles being assembled for installation. The Cuban Missile Crisis consequently began. The Soviet missiles in Cuba were a response to the threat of American missiles placed in Italy and Turkey. With missiles in Cuba, the entire Western Hemisphere was easily in range. Scandal ensued after the spotting of the missile launch sites in Cuba. What transpired before through secret deals and letters was made public during Kennedy's national announcement on October 22nd. He spoke of the Soviet missiles in Cuba and accused the Union of direct action of hostility. Kennedy addressed the world when he said those missiles would reach as far north as Canada and as far south as Peru. He decided to impose a naval quarantine upon Cuba, quarantine being a peaceful substitution for blockade, warning that America was prepared to use military force to neutralize the Cuban threat. Tension neared a climax as Soviet ships came dangerously close to breaching the naval quarantine. Such a chain reaction had the potential to push the world over the brink of nuclear warfare. The ship, however, stopped just short of the blockade as the world held its breath.
Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles in Cuba in exchange for the U.S. promise to make no further attempts of invading Cuba, and following up the letter with the addition that the Cuban missiles would be removed should the missiles of Turkey be removed.
An American U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba. A force was already being prepared off the coast of Florida. The pilot of this plane was technically one of the only casualties of the Cold War. This caused for many to believe that Khrushchev's letter would come to nothing.
Hush-hush negotiations. The United States publicly accepted the first terms of Khrushchev's letter and privately accepted the terms of the second part of the message, which included removing the missiles from Turkey. The affairs were finalized on October 28.